And today we're continuing this journey, and we're just going to kick off the second half of Genesis chapter 1. And over the next 3 or 4 days, we're going to be covering this episode of this agreement between Abraham and Abimelech. And the overall view I've called these next few podcasts is considering the idea of what it means to be living in peace. Now, a few years ago, when I was a pastor of a church, we had many ministries. And at one of those ministry events, a lady came and sat at the table with me with a cup of coffee and asked if she could have a conversation with me. And the whole conversation started out relatively light, really. But there was a moment when that conversation turned and it became much more serious. And she began to pour her heart out to me. And she began to describe several conflicts she had in her life with other people outside her family and people inside her family, and of the confusion and the hurt that those conflicts were causing her. In her own head, she just wanted to know how to deal with these things, because these troubles were really beginning to cause her very deep-seated anxiety. And at one point, she almost just blurted out, "All I want to do is live in peace." Now, she's not the only person who's ever said that to me. I've had others say similar things. Maybe you felt the same way, especially if you've got into a conflict with another person and you reached a point where you thought, "I just want this to end. I just want there to be peace." But not only peace in this situation, but peace in my heart as well. Excuse me. So how do we get to a place when we can live in peace with other people? And is there some key to getting and maintaining peace with other people and the people we know and come into contact with? And that's the question we're going to be considering over the next few days. That is, how can we find, and then importantly, how can we maintain peace with other people? Well, I think there's a principle or two that we can find helpful in the scriptures that are really helpful, in fact, when it comes to this issues. And some of these biblical principles are very clearly illustrated for us in an incident in the life of Abraham here in Genesis chapter 21. And they're, excuse me, they're pretty much as useful in terms of ideas and principles to apply, as useful as any as you'll find in the whole Bible. So let's look together now at Abraham and how now a potential conflict with someone is arising, and let's look at how they both in fact handle it, because maybe this will give us some insight into how to handle conflicts that we might have with other people. So I'm just going to pick up the text and read a couple of verses for you, beginning in Genesis 21, verse 22 to 24. At that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his forces, said to Abraham, "God is with you in everything you do. Now swear to me here before God that you will not deal falsely with me or my children or my descendants. Show to me and the country where you now reside as a foreigner the same kindness I have shown to you." And Abraham said, "I swear it." Now, this is an interesting little section of scripture where we just encountered the situation with Abimelech before in chapter 20, and now we see that this is ongoing, the repercussions of what happened earlier on. This time, Abimelech and Abraham are having a bit of difficulty. And if you remember, the passage started out with Abimelech making a request of Abraham. You see, previously, these two guys had a bit of a conflict going on. Excuse me. And it now ends with the fact that they've got it all settled, or they appear to have, to the point where Abraham had settled and become a resident in the land that fell really under Abimelech's control. Now, Abimelech, we've met before, and the fact that he's here seems, the fact of who he's sent to deal with this incident makes it seem quite a big deal, because it tells us the commander of his army comes to speak to Abraham about this thing. What's interesting to me is he opens his communication by saying, "God is with you in all that you do." Now, if you recall the incident in the previous chapter, what happened then was Abraham God went into Abimelech's territory, and he said to his wife Sarah, "Tell him that you're my sister, not my wife." So Abimelech then put her, Sarah, in his harem, and he planned to marry her, which would have caused all kinds of problems, not only to Sarah and to Abraham, but in relation to the promise that God had made about Sarah to Abraham. But then God appears to Abimelech in a dream, and he tells him to give Sarah back to Abraham, and they resolve the conflict. In that story, God told Abimelech, he also told him that Abraham was a prophet. So he had encountered Abraham prior to these events, and those events concluded with God appearing in a dream. And you may recall that Abimelech had been sick, and because of that, he was unable to consummate the marriage. And that after that, in fact, Abraham prayed for him and he got well. In fact, the whole household had been sick, and Abraham's prayer of restoration after those events was both Abimelech and his household recovered. So there were a number of things going on that had convinced Abimelech that in principle he needed to be careful, because the Lord was with this man Abraham. And he knew, because of all the things that had happened in terms of his relationship and how things had worked out between them. I think it's really fascinating that Abimelech recognizes that the Lord is with everything, was with Abraham and everything he's done. But on the other hand, he also says, by the way, I noticed that you were capable of lying to me. So he says, I want you to swear by your God that you won't deal with me or my household or my future descendants in a false way. I want you to deal honestly with me and uprightly with me, he says. When he had the dream, he gave Sarah back to Abraham. He didn't have to do that in a sense under his own idea of the moral code that he lived under, but he did that probably because the Lord revealing himself to him scared him quite a lot, I would expect now. But he did more than just hand Sarah back. He gave Abraham gifts, and he gave him land within his territories to raise his herds and his flocks. So he's gone the extra mile, hasn't he? He's been kind to Abraham, and he reminds Abraham and tells him, look, I've been kind to you, and all I want you to do is reciprocate that in the way you deal with me. That's my request, that when you deal with me kindly and straightforwardly and honestly. What I find so fascinating here is that on the one hand, he is able to say God's with you in everything you do, and yet also say, you're a liar sometimes. And so in other words, he's saying, Abraham, I've seen both sides of you. But Abraham's reply to verse 24 is very sweet and simple. Abimelech asks him to be clear and honest with him, and he says, I swear it, that I will. From here on, Abraham says, I will deal with you forthrightly and honestly. Abraham is simply requesting honesty and peace, and that's what's basically going on here, so that they can have a straightforward relationship whereby they can live together in peace, so that there should be no more conflicts between them. I don't want you to lie to me anymore, he says, and primarily I don't want you to do that because I don't want there to be any more conflicts where the God of Abraham might need to set in. I want there to be peace between us. And so that's how they begin to make an agreement. In a sense, they make the agreement that that's the principle, but we'll also look at how they ratify that agreement in the next few verses. And today we're continuing our study in Genesis chapter 21 and asking the question, how can we keep peace? And looking at this interaction and the dealing of the issues between Abraham and Abimelech to see if they serve as a template that can help us live in peace in our daily lives. Now, there's a verse in the New Testament in the book of Romans which says this. It says, as much as it be with you, be at peace with all people.
I truly believe that one of the great signs of a mature Christian faith is if we are the type of person who tries always to seek the path of peace. We are told in Ephesians that the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, and other things, but also peace is mentioned in that list. Now, there are many aspects to the peace that Paul's talking about when he talks about the peace that we benefit as a fruit of the Spirit. There's the peace that we can have around us in our lives, and there is a peace, of course, that we can have within us. But most importantly, there is also, of course, the peace that we can have with God, because we know that the issue of our sin has been dealt with once and for all. In Colossians, Paul actually writes and says, "Let the peace of God rule in your heart." Now, the Greek word that was translated rule for us in modern English is a word that means let the peace of God be the umpire in your life. Let peace be the arbiter in your life. Therefore, what that tells me, if there's any tension between you or someone else or in any situation, let peace be the umpire. Now, this passage here in Genesis 21 indicates to me that both these men, Abraham and Abimelech, are seeking peace, and I believe that it can help us do the same. Now, we're going to probe a little bit first and ask what the alternative of living in peace looks like, and what the alternative approach to trying to avoid conflict might look like. Because it seems to me very often when there's a conflict between two people, one of them at heart feels wronged or hurt. I never cease to marvel at how often people often seek revenge and how often they want to see other people hurt. There was a very famous pop psychology book published in the 1970s called Hurt People, Hurt People. But I think that's rather true, because people often, rather than go after seeking peace in a situation where they've experienced conflict, they go out for punishment. The expression, "don't get mad, get even," springs to mind, doesn't it? Now, the people, particularly Christians, wouldn't often always express it like that. They would say things like, "I just want justice," or they would say, "I want them to feel how I feel." But you know what, friends? That's just another way of saying, "I want them to hurt the way I am hurting." Other phrases that are used is they'll say, "I want justice. I want my day in court. I want my pound of flesh," as Shakespeare wrote. Now, the downside of this attitude is that it leaves a feeling of resentment, and one that can grow and grow until it becomes something what the Bible calls angry, bitter resentment. So what that type of attitude ultimately does is make you miserable and angry. And that's no way to have an inner peace. And it's certainly not the way to have peace with other people, peace in your life. And most importantly, it's not the way, friends, to find peace with God. On the other hand, this passage suggests to me that we should practically seek peace, which may mean, on occasion, there should be some compromise. It may even mean a little humility needs to be shown on our part. But it can be worth it, because if we seek peace, the result of that can not only be peace between you and the other party involved, but it can be a real sense of peace within you also. And that's worth aiming for. Now, I think the first part of this message in Genesis chapter 1 is simply saying, in Genesis chapter 21, is simply saying that these two men genuinely recognize that they have differences between them, and they understand that they can't have them anymore if they truly desire to live in peace within the same location. But look at what happens in Genesis 25. On the surface, it may seem a little concerning, but let's see where it leads. Verses 25 and 26 of chapter 1 say, "Then Abraham complained to Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized. But Abimelech said, 'I don't know who has done this. You did not tell me. I heard about it only today.'" Doesn't that sound like a conversation between two people right here today in the 21st century? Abraham brings an accusation of how he feels wrongs. And Abimelech's reaction to that is, I've never heard about this until right now. I didn't even know about this, that this had happened until now. But there is a sense acknowledging here is that what we need to do if we're going to have peace is communicate with one another. As long as there are unresolved differences brewing, there's going to be a trouble between the two of them. And that tells me that if we want to resolve issues, we want to have fewer conflicts in our life, then any of these unresolved issues need to be addressed. You know, a peacemaker is someone who deals with things to bring peace. When Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," on the Sermon on the Mount, if we address that honestly, there has to be acknowledgement that part of being a peacemaker will always involve dealing with situations. And let me remind you, by the way, that that works in marriage as well, and every other type of human relationship. We need to keep short accounts, as someone described it to me. We need to address the small issues as they arrive with grace and humility, because if we don't, they'll build up. And kicking the problem can down the road will not only cause trouble in the future, but it could be a trip hazard which could lead to a serious fall. One of the keys to having a peaceful relationship with people, with other people, in this is about dealing with and clearing the air around the small issues before they become big issues. Now, for them, it will mean some very practical communication and some planning at what they need to do in the future. In fact, the example that is given here, I believe, can act as a template for us to how we too might practically avoid conflict, not only in our personal lives, but in our business and professional relationships as well. And isn't that a really good thing to have? And I've called today's episode Planning for Peace, because it's looking at those verses in Genesis chapter 21, verses 27 to 34, where Abraham and Abimelech attempt to sort of hammer out a way in which they can agree to live together without there being any risk of conflict. And we're looking to see what we can learn from that and how we might apply it in our lives today. So I'm just going to initially pick up the text where we left off last time and read you the opening verse, which today is 21:27, which says, "So Abraham brought sheep and cattle and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a treaty." Now we were told in this verse and the previous that followed that they are together making an agreement, a covenant to live in peace, to live with integrity with each other, to be honest with one another. We're going to make a covenant. We're going to live together in a peaceable way within the same part of the land. And one of the principles of maintaining peace is I believe, if you want to prevent conflict, then there needs to be clear-cut agreement between you and other people. Now, there are many occasions, when sometimes people go into a business relationship, perhaps with friends. Maybe they're just initially just doing something together, and because they don't spell out what the agreement is and who's going to do what and who's going to own what, it can often lead to great conflicts between people. So, tough as it may sound, the greater the detail of the agreement, the less likely there is to be a conflict. The fewer details in the agreement, the more likely it is that there could be tension, that the tension can go and get into those gaps. Where there are gaps, the conflict can get in. One might say the devil can get in and exploit those gaps. Now, as an illustration of that, when I used to pastor a church in the past, there was a situation I inherited where the church hall, as we thought, was being rented by a local theatre group. As the church grew, we decided to initiate midweek meetings in the church, and we went back into the church to use what was called the small hall, the extension room at the side of the main building, perfectly separate to the hall itself, to find that this local youth theatre group had spread and were using the whole building, unbeknown to us. And, in the depths of winter, clearly, bringing heaters and fires in, plugging them in and heating all parts of the building, which was a bit of a shock and a surprise to us as a leadership. And another circumstance where that same extension room, we made it available to a local college who wanted for free, who wanted to teach basic literacy skills and numeracy skills to people, particularly like single mothers or people who were struggling to get off benefits and access employments. So we made that room available to the college that they could use it for free. It was only later, whenever I came into the situation and went in, I found that what the college had been doing was they'd been holding all sorts of courses for free in our building, courses which they were charging the public for, creative writing courses, art appreciation courses. So they were using that building that we thought as a community was a free resource to help support people who were struggling, and it turned out the college were financially benefiting from it. So, but the real problem was not the fact that these things had been done, is that the assumptions and the boundaries had never been spelled out in the beginning. And one of the things I learned is that when situations like that come up, and in those situations, I wasn't involved in either of the cases, the importance of making an agreement from the beginning. Well, I inherited that situation, but together with the leadership team, we sat down and we spelled out a planning arrangement for rooms where we would allow them to be used. We actually decided to only allow them to be used for free for things that help support and build up the community, and no longer hired rooms. So this is what can go wrong if you don't spell out or make an agreement beforehand, even in terms of the things of our Christian life and our Christian ministries. I learned back then that sometimes we need to make an arrangement. We need to make a covenant, a contract, if you wish, that spells things out. So if we go back to the text and pick up in verse 28, it then tells us this. Abraham set apart 7 ewe lambs from the flock, and Abimelech asked Abraham, what is the meaning of the 7 ewe lambs you have set apart? So what in the world does that mean? And what does it really mean in the 21st century? What's the equivalent today? Well, verse 30, to an extent, the next verse will explain it. He replied, accept these 7 lambs from my hand as a witness that I dug this well. So that place was called Beersheba, because the 2 men swore an oath there. So today, at that time, they didn't put things on paper. At that time, the contract was ratified through the gift of sheep. But today, we tend to put things down on paper. So they're going to settle and make an agreement, and they're doing this in order that they don't have any more conflicts. But let me just close out this chapter for you, and then we'll have a look at bringing it all together and maybe summarizing it. So picking up in verse 32 to the end of the chapter, it says, after the treaty had been made at Beersheba, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his forces, returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he called upon the name of the Lord, the eternal God. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines for a long time. Now, this tree, this tamarisk, by the way, is a symbolic tree. It's symbolic of the fact that the Lord, the everlasting God, is going to give the land as an everlasting property to Abraham and his family generations that follows on. Because in that day, a tamarisk tree was seen as an everlasting thing. The fact that it was what we would today call an evergreen in the mind of the people there suggested that it was everlasting. And by the end of this chapter, we see that Abraham has taken up his residence in this part of the land. And the first things he does, he marks that, and he does it by planting an evergreen tree as a symbol of the fact that God has given him this part of the land. Now, this is the time he finally gets to the point of legally owning the land. He now is seen to have the legal rights to it. God promised it to him and in a sense gave it to him way back in chapter 12, and he's been sojourning there with the people as a visitor for a time, but this is the first time he actually gets a portion of the land promised legally, so to speak. Promised first, then ratified by God, and now finally ratified in the civilian, the sort of legal process way of that time. And in verse 34, remember, said, and Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines many days. Now, what I want you to notice is the author here is taking pains to point out that this was the land of the Philistines. In fact, if you look, he mentions it twice. In the close of this passage, he mentions it in verse 32 and then again in verse 34. In other words, what I believe this is telling us is he plants a tree that's an evergreen tree, and it's symbolically saying that this land is ours, and that tree is planted as a symbolic act to be a sign to the local Philistine tribal leaders that this land now belonged to him. But it also tells us that what he did there was he called upon the name of the Lord. Now that sounds a bit like a prayer in our language when you hear he called upon the name of the Lord. But many Bible experts and teachers say that although that's true, it includes more than prayer. It includes a proclamation. So he's not only just calling upon the name of the Lord, he's calling out the name of the Lord in whose name he is claiming the land. But the real point here is for the first time, Abraham is seen to have a legal right to own a portion of the land, a place where there is a well, and that he can live there permanently. And that one day, of course, we know he's going to own the whole region. It's going to be given to him by God. Yet today he's trusting the Lord to give to him what the Lord said. And this is the beginning of that process. And today I'm just going to summarize for you Genesis chapter 21, which we've been in for a few days, and try and reach maybe some conclusions on this chapter, which I've given the overall title to of Planning for Peace. So to quickly summarize where we're up to, very straightforwardly, I think this passage, well, it's obviously about this conflict between these two men, Abraham and Abimelech, or the potential for conflict that there was between these two men. But more than that, it's how they are seen to plan to put in place a process by which they can reach a resolution on any of the issues that are currently between them, so that primarily they can avoid any potential for conflict in the future. So Abraham and Abimelech have been seen to make a covenant to live in peace, to make sure that any potential pinch points, any problem areas in the future might not jeopardize the peace that exists between them. Now, what this tells me today is that as believers, we need to make up our minds to practically seek peace, to keep short accounts, as someone I once heard it described, and to communicate clearly with one another. If there are problems, that we should address them early and make an agreement, and if necessary, spell out the details of what that agreement is. You see, when we have, as Christian believers, we have a potential conflict arising with someone, we have three possible choices to make. Number one is we can just ignore the problem and hope that it goes away. But I think I spelled out in the last couple of episodes that the problem of ignoring an issue, particularly if that conflict relates to sin or wrong behavior, the Bible calls that particular way of dealing with an issue, if it's about sin, it means that you actually become an appeaser, and appeasement will always cause problem when the core root of the problem is sin. The second thing you can do, which is what a lot of ordinary people seem to do nowadays, is go to court. We are becoming a more and more litigious society, but we need, I believe the Bible tries to impress us that we need to try and curtail that option, especially within the Christian community. Paul writes very clearly on that in 1 Corinthians. In fact, in 1 Corinthians, he offers a third option in what he calls settling things among ourselves or within ourselves. Now, let's be clear, when it comes to settling and dealing with issues or matters of conflict, this clearly does not apply where matters relate to the clear law of the land that's been broken. For instance, where there's issues of fraud or theft, or any matters relating to the safeguarding of children or vulnerable adults. I think it is absolutely vital that we hand those issues over to the relevant authorities. But in the normal areas of personal conflicts between Christians, or when as an individual you find yourself at odds with another believer, the correct response that Paul outlines for us and is illustrated here in the story of Abraham and Abimelech is that initially we should go and speak to that other person individually. Now, if that doesn't work, then the recommendation is we take another believer with us. And if both parties involved in this conflict are Christians, then it actually advises that if they're within the same church, they may be the person they take should be an elder or a church leader with them to try and resolve it. But the attitude needs to always be to approach that potential conflict in a way that means they don't pursue more conflict, I suppose, that they're always seeking peace. Now, years ago, when I was growing up, I remember there was a Christian organization. I don't think it exists anymore, but it was called the Christian Coalition. And its purpose was to arbitrate in disputes between Christians, situations which might otherwise end up in court. Now, one article I read on it in a Christian magazine, it's probably over 30 years ago, it was an interview with the chief executive, and it listed the kind of things that they regularly dealt with. He talked about a situation where someone blamed their Christian financial advisor for a £20,000 investment that had gone bad. Another case involved them helping a young woman who changed her mind and wanted the child back that she'd handed over to an adoptive family. On a very mundane level, another example that I remember was someone was upset because a minister's dog barked at night, and but they didn't want to involve the police or the council because they didn't want to ruin the minister's reputation by taking the matter to civil authorities. But most of the work of the Christian Coalition was in arbitrating in marital disputes. But what got my attention about this article was the Christian Coalition's chief executive. He said their primary willingness to take on the case was the fact that the party who was initiating the claim, they needed to believe that it was more important to them than to resolve a shattered relationship than any financial reward or remuneration that might be involved. Now, I think biblically people are called to live in peace. And that's the attitude that we should take. The resolution of conflict is much more important than money or barking dogs for that matter. As a result, the article said, and I thought this was interesting, the chief executive said that most people, after going through their Christian process, ended up friendlier than they had ever been and decided what they were fighting about wasn't that important in the first place. Now, it's interesting to contrast that to what happens in the court of law in the land, and I would assume in any land, in any country that you happen to be based, because certainly my experience of the law in this country is that one party usually wins and the other party loses, and everyone is still left feeling hostile to each other. But the New Testament teaches, and it reminds you very much of that in the book of Romans, it tells us that if it is at all possible, and as much as it depends on you, live peaceably with all people. And thanks be to God, this teaching gives us a template on how we might do that. Okay, that's it for today, and we've closed off chapter 21. I'd remind you that you can pop back again here next time, and we'll pick up the beginning of chapter 22, and we'll consider over the next few days about what it might teach us about how God might test us. Now, a quick reminder that you can always access a transcript of all of these talks if you find the audio version of the podcast, which is hosted on the Buzzsprout Bible Project podcast website or through any of the main sort of app stores or places where you're downloading this podcast from, like iTunes or Apple's or Spotify or whatever. There's always in the audio version a direct link through in the episode notes to a full transcript of everything that's been said. If you're watching on the video version on Facebook or YouTube, there's usually a link there through to the audio version where you'll find the transcript. But if you've just arrived today for the first time, why not consider going right back to the very beginning and joining us on this amazing, what I believe will be a 10-year journey through the whole Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. So anyway, that's it for today, and I'll hopefully see you right back here tomorrow on the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Goodbye for now.